The forgotten hero. The afternoon sun filtered through the Family Feud studio windows, casting golden streaks across rows of expectant faces. It was supposed to be another day of laughter and competition, another episode filled with the comfortable rhythm of buzzers and applause that had made the show America's favorite game show for decades. But sometimes, television becomes something more profound than entertainment. Sometimes it becomes a bridge between past and present, between forgotten sacrifices and long overdue recognition. In the third row, center section, sat a man who seemed almost transparent in his quietness. Robert Bobby Thompson, 68 years old, wore a simple navy blue cardigan that had seen better years and khaki pants pressed with the military precision that some habits never abandon. His weathered hands, marked by decades of construction work and the subtle tremor that came from memories he tried not to revisit, rested carefully on his knees. Everything about his posture suggested a man who had learned to occupy as little space as possible, who had perfected the art of being present without being noticed. Beside him sat his 3 grandchildren, the reason he had agreed to this television adventure, despite every instinct that told him to stay home, to remain invisible, to avoid the kind of attention that had never brought him anything but pain. Sarah, 20, was a junior at Ohio State University, studying journalism, her bright smile and confident demeanor inherited from her grandmother, but tempered by the gentle compassion that came from growing up in a family that understood suffering. Michael, 18, was preparing for his first year of college on a football scholarship, his athletic frame and easy laugh masking the protective instincts he had developed toward his grandfather. And Emma, 16, was the artist of the family, quiet and observant, with the kind of sensitivity that allowed her to see things others missed. The Thompson family had been selected for Family Feud after Sarah submitted their application with a letter that spoke about her grandfather's humility, his dedication to his family, and his reluctance to ever speak about his own experiences. She had written about a man who had raised her and her siblings after their parents died in a car accident, who had worked double shifts at the construction site to pay for piano lessons and college applications, who had never missed a school play or graduation, despite the panic attacks that crowds sometimes triggered. What Sarah hadn't written because she didn't know was that her grandfather carried within him a story that connected him to the very stage where he now sat. She didn't know about the young soldier he had pulled from a burning helicopter in the jungles of Vietnam in 1968. About the split-second decision that had saved a life and created a debt that had never been acknowledged. She didn't know that the man now approaching the podium with his characteristic warmth and humor owed his existence, and therefore his career, his family, his entire life, to the quiet man sitting in row 3. Steve Harvey stepped into the lights wearing his signature style, with the confidence that came from years of understanding his audience, his craft, and his responsibility to create moments of joy for millions of viewers. His navy suit was perfectly tailored, his smile genuine, his energy infectious. He had hosted thousands of episodes, had perfected the balance between humor and heart that made him beloved by families across America. But as he began his usual pre-show routine, scanning the audience for the energy and enthusiasm that would fuel the next hour, his eyes were drawn to something unusual. In the third row, surrounded by 3 young people whose excitement was almost palpable, sat a man who seemed to be trying to disappear into his seat. There was something about Bobby Thompson's stillness that caught Steve's attention and held it. It wasn't the nervous energy of someone uncomfortable with television, or the shy withdrawal of someone unused to crowds. It was something deeper, more familiar. It was the careful positioning of someone who had learned to be watchful, who had developed hypervigilance as a survival mechanism, who scanned exits and calculated distances without conscious thought. Steve had seen this before. His father had carried himself the same way in certain situations, with the particular alertness of someone who had seen combat, who had learned that safety was never guaranteed and vigilance was a habit that could save your life. During the commercial break before taping began, Steve did something he rarely did. Instead of reviewing his notes or chatting with producers, he walked into the audience. He moved through the rows with his usual warmth, shaking hands and making small talk, but his destination was clear. "Afternoon, folks," he said when he reached the Thompson family row. "Y'all ready to have some fun today?" Sarah, Michael, and Emma responded with enthusiasm, their excitement bubbling over as they introduced themselves. But Bobby remained quiet, offering only a polite nod and a handshake that was firm but brief. "And you must be Granddad," Steve said, settling into a crouch beside Bobby's seat. There was something in the older man's eyes, a depth that spoke of experiences that couldn't be shared in casual conversation, that made Steve want to linger in this moment longer than television schedules typically allowed. "Robert Thompson," Bobby said quietly. "Bobby, thank you for having us, Mr. Harvey. Call me Steve, and thank you for coming. Takes courage to get up here in front of all these cameras and lights." Bobby's smile was slight but genuine. These kids have been excited about this for months. Couldn't let them down. There was something in the way Bobby spoke, in the measured cadence of his words, and the way his eyes seemed to catalog every detail of his surroundings, that felt familiar to Steve. It reminded him of stories his father used to tell about coming home from Vietnam, about the adjustments required to exist in a world where the hypervigilance that had kept you alive in combat became a barrier to peace in civilian life. "You served?" Steve asked quietly, the question coming from an intuition he couldn't quite explain. Bobby's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the kind of change that would be invisible to most people, but that Steve caught because he had learned to read the subtle signs of pain and pride that veterans carried. "Long time ago," Bobby said. "Vietnam 67 to 69. Steve nodded, understanding that this was both an answer and a boundary. Many veterans of that era had learned that their service was something to acknowledge quietly, rather than discuss publicly, that the country's complicated relationship with that war meant their sacrifice was often met with silence, rather than gratitude. "My dad served there too," Steve said, his voice carrying a warmth that invited connection without demanding it. "James Harvey. He was there around the same time." Bobby went very still, so still that for a moment Steve wondered if he had said something wrong. The older man's eyes searched Steve's face with an intensity that was almost unsettling, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle that had missing pieces. "James Harvey," Bobby repeated slowly, and his voice carried something that made Steve lean closer. "Hellhelter crew chief, 1st Cavalry Division?" Steve's breath caught. His father had been exactly that, but it wasn't information he had shared publicly, wasn't something that would be common knowledge. "How did—" "Saigon, November 1968, Bobby said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Helicopter went down outside the city. Crew of 4. The commercial break was ending. Producers were signaling for Steve to return to his position. The audience was settling back into their seats, expecting the show to begin. But Steve couldn't move. Bobby's words had unlocked something, had connected to a story he had heard only fragments of throughout his childhood. "You knew my father," Steve said, and it wasn't a question. Bobby nodded once, a movement so small it was almost imperceptible. "I knew your father." Steve looked toward the production booth, toward the cameras that were about to start rolling, toward the schedule that demanded his attention. Then he looked back at Bobby Thompson, at the quiet man who had just revealed a connection that transcended television, that reached back to a jungle on the other side of the world, and a moment that had shaped the course of multiple lives. "We need to talk," Steve said. "After the show, we need to talk." The cameras came alive, the theme music began, and Steve returned to his mark with his professional smile in place. But something fundamental had shifted. The show continued its familiar rhythm. Families were introduced. Questions were asked. Buzzers were pressed. But Steve's attention kept drifting to row 3. To the man whose quiet presence had suddenly become the most important thing in the studio. The Thompson family played their game with enthusiasm and grace. Sarah proved to be quick with answers. Michael brought athletic competitiveness to every question. And Emma surprised everyone with insights that were both creative and accurate. They were winning, building momentum toward the final round, and their joy was infectious. But Bobby remained quiet throughout, offering encouraging smiles to his grandchildren, but never volunteering to participate himself. Steve noticed the way the young people deferred to their grandfather with obvious love and respect, the way they included him in their celebrations even though he seemed more comfortable watching than participating. During another commercial break, Steve found himself drawn back to row 3. This time, he was more direct. "Bobby," he said, "I need you to tell me about November." Bobby looked at his grandchildren, who were chatting excitedly about their performance so far. Then back at Steve. "Not here," he said quietly. "Not like this." Steve understood. This wasn't a story for television cameras, for public consumption. This was something private, something secret. But he also understood that some stories demand to be told, that some connections are too important to remain hidden. After the show, Steve said, "Promise me." Bobby nodded, and in that nod, Steve saw something that looked like relief, as if the older man had been carrying a weight for 55 years and was finally ready to set it down. The show continued, but both men were somewhere else now, transported to a jungle halfway around the world, and a moment that had changed everything. Steve found himself studying Bobby's face during the answers, looking for clues about the man who had somehow intersected with his family's history in ways he was only beginning to understand. When the final buzzer sounded and the Thompson family was declared the winners, their celebration was joyful but brief. Steve made his usual closing remarks, thanked the families for playing, and promised the audience at home that they would return tomorrow with more fun and surprises. But as soon as the cameras stopped rolling, as soon as the audience began to file out, and the crew began their post-show routines, Steve did something unprecedented. He asked the Thompson family to stay, to wait while the studio emptied, to give him a few minutes of private time. Sarah, Michael, and Emma were curious, but compliant, understanding that something significant was happening, even if they didn't understand what. Bobby sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap, waiting for a conversation that was 55 years overdue. When the studio was finally empty except for a minimal crew, Steve pulled up a chair and sat facing Bobby directly. The bright television lights had been dimmed to a warm amber that made the space feel more intimate, more conducive to the kind of conversation that changes people. "Tell me," Steve said simply. Bobby was quiet for a long moment, as if organizing thoughts that had been carefully stored for decades. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of memory and the precision of someone who had rehearsed this story in his mind countless times, but had never shared it aloud. "November 15th, 1968, he began. "I was with a search and rescue unit. We got word that a helicopter had gone down about 15 kilometers outside Saigon. Mechanical failure, not enemy fire, but in a hot zone where any delay could mean the difference between rescue and recovery." Steve leaned forward, completely absorbed in a story that was about to explain something fundamental about his own existence. "When we reached the crash site, the bird was on its side, partially submerged in a rice paddy. 3 of the crew had made it out, but 1 was trapped inside. The fuel was leaking, and we could smell smoke. Everyone knew what that meant." Bobby paused, and Steve could see him returning to that moment, reliving decisions made in seconds that would resonate for decades. The crew chief was unconscious, pinned under twisted metal. The other guys had tried to get him out, but they couldn't get the right angle, couldn't get enough leverage, and the smoke was getting thicker. Steve's throat felt tight. He knew without being told that the trapped crew chief was his father, that this story was about the moment that had allowed James Harvey to return home, to marry Steve's mother, to raise the family that would eventually produce the man now listening to this account. "I was smaller than the other guys in my unit," Bobby continued. "Could fit into spaces they couldn't, so I went in after him." The simplicity of the statement belied the courage it represented. Steve understood that Bobby was describing a moment when someone had chosen to risk his own life to save a stranger, had made a split-second decision that exemplified the best of human nature. Took me 3 tries to get him free. Had to use a piece of the landing gear as a lever. Had to crawl in there while the whole thing was shifting and settling. By the time I got him out, we could see flames starting in the engine compartment. Bobby looked directly at Steve, and in his eyes was something Steve had never seen before. The look of someone who had held a secret for 55 years and was finally setting it free. I carried your father to the evacuation zone, Bobby said. He was unconscious the whole time, never knew who pulled him out. When he came to at the field hospital, I was already back on patrol. We never spoke, never met. I just did what needed doing and moved on. Steve felt tears beginning to form, understanding that he was hearing about the moment that had made his entire life possible. Every achievement, every milestone, every moment of joy he had ever experienced existed because this quiet man had been willing to crawl into a burning helicopter to save a stranger. How do you know it was my father? Steve asked, though he already believed the answer. I kept track, Bobby said simply. It was the only time I ever pulled someone out of a crash who survived. I wanted to know if it mattered, if saving one life had been worth the nightmares that followed. So I kept track of James Harvey from Ohio. Found out he made it home, got married, had a family, found out his son became someone who makes people laugh, who brings joy to families across the country. The weight of this revelation settled over Steve like a blanket. Every episode he had ever hosted, every family he had entertained, every moment of laughter he had created, existed because Bobby Thompson had been brave enough to risk everything for a stranger. You've been watching my career, Steve said, and it wasn't a question. For 40 years, Bobby admitted. Never thought about making contact, never wanted to intrude. But when my granddaughter sent in that application, when I found out we were coming here, I thought maybe it was time. Steve looked toward Bobby's grandchildren, who had been listening to this story with growing amazement. They were learning something about their grandfather that explained so much about the man who had raised them. His quiet strength, his selflessness, his reluctance to talk about his own heroism. Sarah, Steve said, turning toward Bobby's granddaughter, do you understand what your grandfather just told me? Sarah's eyes were bright with tears and pride. He saved your father's life, she said. He's the reason you exist. Steve nodded, then did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He stood up, walked to Bobby's chair, and knelt down in front of the man who had changed the course of his family's history. Sir, he said, his voice thick with emotion, I don't know how to thank you for what you did. I don't know how to express what it means to know that my father lived because of your courage, that my family exists because you were willing to risk everything for someone you didn't even know. Bobby's own eyes were wet now, the careful emotional control he had maintained for decades finally giving way. Your father would have done the same for me, he said. That's who we were, who we had to be. We looked out for each other. But you're the one who did it, Steve said. You're the one who went into that helicopter. You're the one who brought my father home. What happened next was captured by the few cameras that were still rolling, footage that would become one of the most powerful moments in television history. Steve Harvey, the successful comedian and television host, wrapped his arms around Bobby Thompson, the quiet construction worker from Ohio, and held him the way a son holds a father, the way someone holds a hero. Thank you, Steve whispered, and the words carried 55 years of gratitude that had been waiting to be expressed. Thank you for my father. Thank you for my life. Thank you for everything. Bobby held him back, this stranger who felt like family, and for the first time in decades allowed himself to believe that what he had done in that rice paddy had mattered, that the nightmares and flashbacks and survivor's guilt had been worth it. When they finally separated, Steve turned to face Bobby's grandchildren, these young people who were seeing their grandfather in an entirely new light. Do you know what kind of man raised you? He asked them. Do you understand that you were brought up by someone who defines the word hero? Emma, the 16-year-old artist, was the first to move. She walked to her grandfather and took his hands in hers. Grandpa, she said, Why didn't you ever tell us? Bobby's smile was soft and sad. Because heroes don't talk about being heroes, he said. You just do what needs doing and move on. Michael and Sarah joined their sister, surrounding their grandfather with the kind of love and admiration that he had never allowed himself to feel he deserved. For Bobby Thompson, this moment represented something he had never imagined possible. Recognition not just for his service, but for the specific act of courage that had defined his life. Steve stepped back, watching this family reunion with the understanding that he had been given an extraordinary gift. Not just the knowledge of how his father had survived Vietnam, but the opportunity to thank the man responsible, to close a circle that had been open for more than 5 decades. Bobby, he said, I want to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Bobby looked up from his grandchildren, curious about what this moment might bring next. I want to tell this story, Steve said. I want people to know about what you did, about the kind of courage you showed, about how one person's bravery can ripple forward through generations. Will you let me do that? Bobby was quiet for a long moment, weighing his lifelong preference for privacy against the possibility that his story might inspire others, might help people understand what veterans had sacrificed, what heroes looked like in real life. If it helps people understand, he said finally, then yes. 6 months later, Bobby Thompson appeared on a special episode of Family Feud that was dedicated to honoring veterans and their families. But he appeared not as a contestant but as an honored guest, sharing the stage with Steve Harvey as they told the story of November 15, 1968, and the moment that had connected their families across decades. The response was overwhelming. Veterans organizations across the country reached out to Bobby, thanking him not just for his service, but for his willingness to share his story. Families who had lost loved ones in Vietnam found comfort in knowing that sometimes rescue was possible, that some soldiers did make it home because of the extraordinary courage of their fellow service members. Bobby's grandchildren became advocates for veteran recognition, using their grandfather's story to raise awareness about PTSD, survivor's guilt, and the ongoing needs of aging veterans. Sarah wrote her senior thesis about the long-term psychological impact of combat heroism, examining how acts of courage can sometimes become sources of lifelong trauma. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome was the relationship that developed between the Harvey and Thompson families. Steve invited Bobby and his grandchildren to be permanent guests at Family Feud tapings, creating an extended family connection that honored the bond forged in a Vietnamese rice paddy 55 years earlier. What I learned from Bobby, Steve often says when telling this story, is that heroes don't always look like what we expect. Sometimes they're quiet construction workers who never talk about what they've done. Sometimes they carry their courage so privately that even their own families don't know the depth of their sacrifice. Bobby Thompson, the man who had spent decades believing he was just someone who had done his job, discovered that he was someone who had changed the course of history in ways he had never imagined. The quiet grandfather who had raised 3 remarkable young people was revealed to be the hero who had made it possible for one of America's most beloved entertainers to exist. Today, at 73, Bobby Thompson still lives quietly in Ohio, but he no longer sees himself as just a veteran who did what was necessary. He understands now that what he did in that rice paddy was extraordinary, that his courage created ripples that are still spreading, that sometimes the most important moments in our lives are the ones we're least likely to talk about. The construction worker who pulled a stranger from a burning helicopter became the grandfather who raised 3 college-bound kids, who became the hero who saved the father of someone who brings joy to millions of families, who became the symbol of quiet courage that defines the best of America. Sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that wait 55 years to be told. Sometimes heroes spend decades not knowing they're heroes. And sometimes, on a television stage dedicated to family and laughter, the past and present collide in ways that remind us that every life we touch, every moment of courage we choose, every stranger we help creates possibilities we may never know about. but that matter more than we can imagine. The quiet man in row 3 became the reason millions of people laughed together every day. And that, Bobby Thompson fondly understands, was worth crawling into a burning helicopter to achieve.